7. Socrates and Plato. The political focus of philosophy appeared more clearly in Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, where we have more documentation of their position. Socrates, a statist and a homosexual, is the object of the most appalling idolatry. Kroner, in reading Plato's dialogues, is reminded of the Gospel stories. He agrees with Justin Martyr in comparing Christ with Socrates. Indeed, Socrates was a Greek anticipation and a counterpart of Jesus Christ, but one has to remember that such a Greek Christ was no Christ at all. Nevertheless, the human features of the two personalities can be compared without blasphemy. For Voegelin, the life and death of Socrates were the decisive events in the discovery and liberation of the soul. Some scholars have been ready to point out, however, that Socrates was guilty as charged and merited the sentence of death. Socrates was a champion not of the rights of man, but of the rights of Superman, and his circle of friends and disciples were close to or involved in the imposition of a reign of terror in Athens 4 years prior to Socrates' condemnation. Basic to his trial, although Plato did not mention it, was the political issue. Socrates expressed his contempt for the Athenian jury, comparing them to children trying a doctor on a cook's charges. The esoteric background is close to the surface in Socrates, who, in the Symposium, according to Fight, finds the key to the universe in the fact of boy love or pederasty. Plato shared the same opinion most of his life, only dropping it to a measure in his old age in the Laws. Discussions of Plato usually concentrate on the Platonic doctrine of ideas or forms, and the result is a serious distortion, because central to Plato is not the doctrine of ideas, but his concept of the city-state, of which the ideas are simply a central aspect. In Plato's Gorgias, some wise men tell us that friendship and community and orderliness, cosmioles, and moderation bind together heaven and earth, gods and men, and that this whole is therefore called order, cosmos, not disorder, ekosmia. The cosmos is a community of gods and men, and the city-state is such a cosmos. It embraces both the human and the divine, both matter and form, and controls both chaos and order. From idea, order, mind, and the divine are related, if not basically one. Justice is the subjection of all things to this divine human order, and liberty is, therefore, the negation of justice. The guardians, or elites of the state, represent godlike wisdom, and they must be obeyed. The citizens must be educated into accepting this wisdom of the elites as their own mind in order to obey voluntarily, but, if not, it must be imposed from without. Then, in order that such a person may be governed by an authority similar to that by which the best man is governed, do we not maintain that he ought to be made a servant of that best man, in whom the divine element is supreme? We do not indeed imagine that the servant ought to be governed to his own detriment, which Thrasymachus held to be the lot of the subject. On the contrary, we believe it to be the better for everyone to be governed by a wise and divine power, which ought, if possible, to be seated in a man's own heart, the only alternative being to impose it from without, in order that we may be all alike, so far as nature permits, and mutual friends, from the fact of being steered by the same pilot. Justice, for Plato, means that, in the individual, reason rules over the will and the appetite, and, in the body politic, it is the rule by the philosopher-king over all other men. Justice is produced in the soul like health in the body by establishing the elements concerned in their natural relations of control and subordination, whereas injustice is like disease and means that this natural order is inverted. There is thus no transcendental justice, no appeal beyond the guardian dictatorship which, in its person, incarnates the divine wisdom and the idea of justice. This is clearly demonstrated in the concept of truth. Since the state is the ultimate order, it stands above law. Men are responsible to the state, not the state to its citizens. Truth and falsehood are held to be only instrumental, comparable to medicine, and hence must be kept in the hands of physicians, and unprofessional men must not meddle with it. These physicians who use truth and falsehood as social medicines are the rulers of the state. To the rulers of the state, then, if to any, it belongs of right to use falsehood to deceive either enemies or their own citizens for the good of the state. The good of the state, as seen by its rulers, is the highest law, and this means that the rulers are the embodiment of that law, or at the least, its source of expression. Seen thus in the perspective of Plato, which is the perspective of the city-state, the basic ideas are philosopher-kings, guardians or dictators, in whom the divine element is supreme, as Socrates believed concerning himself, men in whom, to use Cornford's translation, a power of godlike wisdom resides. Anaxagoras held that mind was the physical element in the universe and the principle of order. The young Socrates read Anaxagoras with enthusiasm and then disappointment, for, in his nous, or mind, promised much but stopped short of fulfillment. The Platonic idea, derived in part from Socrates, was more than matter. It was a kind of structure. It was order, sole, and universal. It was the one against or over the many, but it was clearly above all else the elite and ruling body of the Republic. The ideas of Plotinus cannot be read back into Plato. For Plato, the ideas are supremely manifested in the guardians. In them, the order of being is manifested. To the extent that their ideas are bypassed, the state is threatened with chaos, for they are the order of the state. Plato's Republic, in attaining its main purpose and function, justice, does not abolish war, nor is the abolition of war even hinted at. Economic self-sufficiency is required, but the abolition of poverty is not promised, and luxury is definitely condemned. In terms of modern utopias, the Republic indeed promises very little, because its concept of utopia is not the material fulfillment of the people, but total government by the elite. Dictatorship by the intellectuals is, in fact, both the goal and the products of the Republic, and its